She gained a certain form of confidence and fearlessness that allowed her to express herself on the deepest level.
She was born into an upper middle class Milanese family. The standards, not only of beauty, but of acceptable femininity, was quite restricted.
She goes through a wide variety of very theatrical fashion that teeters on the edge between couture and costume.
She was an anachronism. She seemed to belong to the world of late Romanticism.
Greetings, everyone. We're here today to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the original publication of Infinite Variety, The Life and Legend of the Marchesa Casati, the first full-length comprehensive biography of this amazing woman who lived from 1881 to 1957. We're going to begin with introducing ourselves. So I'm going to start with a brief biographical overview of my co-author, Scott D. Ryersson. Scott D. Ryersson was the author of numerous critiques and essays on film and literature. He published interviews with author Anne Rice, actress Diana Rigg, Poirot actor David Suchet, Marple actress Joan Hickson, and film director Tim Burton, among many others, as well as an analysis of the little-known supernatural fiction of Agatha Christie. He also penned the novellas Poisoned Ivy, The Arsenic Flower, Mad, Bad, and Dangerous to Know, and the 1 PFR-nominated short story, Summer's Lease. His poetry appeared in The New Yorker. As an artist, Scott trained at London's Chelsea School of Art and Design before entering the field of motion picture advertising. Throughout a 30-year career, he designed multi-award-winning graphics for numerous Hollywood and international films, including The Silence of the Lambs, Ghost, The Doors, The Changeling, White Mischief, The Hunt for Red October, Witness, Another Country, and Evil Under the Sun. Recipient of 2 Art Directors of London Awards, his work continues to be voted among the top of several greatest film posters of all time lists. His pen and ink illustrations appeared in publications worldwide. Scott created and exhibited numerous arcanifacts, a term for his one-of-a-kind mixed media, assemblage, and collage pieces, which explore his artistic obsession with the arcane and phantasmagorical. As for myself, I have written on genre films and their creators, unconventional historical figures, and the occult. And I should have noted my name is Michael Orlando Yaccarino. I'm a film studies graduate from New York University's Tisch School of the Arts, which included an extended internship at the Film Studies Center of the Museum of Modern Art. My critical writings and interviews have championed world fringe cinema for decades. Having researched, practiced, taught, and written about the tarot for many years, I am the author of Heart Vision, Tarot's Inner Path, which Scott illustrated. Together, Scott and I are the co-authors of Infinite Variety, The Life and Legend of the Marchesa Casati, and a one-woman play based upon it, the decadent fairy tale, The Princess of Wax, A Cruel Tale, and the art book, The Marchesa Casati Portraits of a Muse. We also co-edited Spectral Haunts and Phantom Lovers, an audiobook collection of British ghost stories. Based in the United States, the Casati Archives is the world's only data source and image bank devoted to preserving the artistic and cultural legacy of the Marchesa Luisa Casati. Scott and I founded it 25 years ago in 1999 upon the original publication of Infinite Variety. It is the result of ongoing international research and collecting. In addition to a wealth of original materials, books, and ephemera, This ever-growing library contains artwork reproductions and photographs of and inspired by the Marchesa Casati. The Casati Archives provides images and information for writers, researchers, and publishers worldwide, as well as consulting services for the world's leading museums, galleries, and private collectors. It would be terribly remiss not to fully recognize Infinite Variety's provenance, to use an art term, and this most definitively belongs to Scott D. Ryersson. For it was Scott's original in-person viewing of Augustus John's celebrated 1919 portrait of Casati many decades ago, which first ignited a curiosity within him about this extraordinary being, which remained inexhaustible until his passing earlier this year. Indeed, he likened this catalytic moment to an actual visceral encounter. Scott's tireless research is wholly responsible for the book's proven accuracy and remarkable comprehensiveness. Indeed, every subsequent edition of the biography around the world contains research gems most currently uncovered at the time of its publication. How wonderful then that Scott was here for Infinite Variety's 2024 quarter-century milestone, that is 25 years of our 38 years together as life partners. And now I would like to introduce our other speakers today, and we can begin with Valerie Steele.
Hi, I'm Valerie Steele. I'm Director and Chief Curator of the Museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology, where I've organized more than 24 exhibitions since 1997, including The Corset, Fashioning the Body, Gothic Dark Glamour, and A Queer History of Fashion. I am also the author or editor of more than 25 books, including Paris Fashion, Fetish, Fashion, Sex, and Power, and Fashion Designers A to Z, the collection of the museum at FIT. My books have been translated into Chinese, French, German, Italian, Portuguese, Russian, and soon also Japanese and Spanish. I'm also founder and editor of Fashion Theory, the Journal of Dress, Body, and Culture, which is the first peer-reviewed scholarly journal in fashion studies.
Thank you so much, Valerie. Joan T. Rosasco.
I'm Joan Rosasco. My field of interest has always been European art and culture, particularly French. I taught French literature at Smith College and at Columbia University, some courses also at NYU. My publications have mostly been on the Belle Époque. My book on Proust, Voix de l'imagination proustienne, was published by Nizet in Paris, and I also have various other publications. I also have worked with Exhibitions International to organize traveling art exhibitions, and notably the Jewels of Lalique in 1998. And it was in association with that project that I encountered Infinite Variety. I was reading it on the airplane going to Paris to be with Madame Brunamer, curator of the exhibition, and saw the photograph of Luisa Casati wearing the Lalique crown that he had created for Sarah Bernhardt in Theodora. So for me, that was the way into the subject. That's when I met Scott and Michael, and we've been friends ever since.
Thank you so much, Joan. And finally, Francesca Granata.
Hello, everyone. My name is Francesca Granata, and I'm Associate Professor of Fashion Studies in the School of Art and Design, History and Theory at Parsons School of Design. My research centers on modern contemporary visual and material culture with a focus on fashion history and theory, gender and performance studies. I have written several publications that look at the intersection of fashion and performance, experimental fashion, performance art, and the grotesque body. My book from Bloomsbury 2017, addresses these issues. And I've also edited 2 books. One is Fashion Criticism and Anthology, also from Bloomsbury. And the other one is Fashion Projects, 15 Years of Fashion in Dialogue, which is the collected work from a journal, a nonprofit journal I ran from 2005 to 2025, called Fashion Projects.
And Francesca, we should mention, of course, that you are responsible for the lovely and insightful new foreword to Infinite Variety that have been added in the University of Minnesota Press's 2017 republication of the biography. So you are represented in the book itself as well. Thank you, everyone. And now, as perhaps a way into our fabulous subject, I'm going to read an excerpted version of Infinite Variety's introduction. And after Joan's flawless French terms, I'm going to ask your forgiveness if I butcher a few that are included in this introduction as I read. I want to be a living work of art. These are among the only words spoken by the Marchesa Luisa Casati that have been documented. For the first 3 decades of the 20th century, the Marchesa Casati was the brightest star of the European haute monde. Artists painted and sculpted her, poets praised her strange beauty, and couturiers fought for her patronage. She had even become the notorious fictional heroine of more than one author's risque romanacles. She journeyed wherever her fancy took her, Venice, Rome, Paris, Capri, collecting palaces and a menagerie of exotic animals, and she spent fortunes on lavish parties. She astonished Gabriele D'Annunzio, fascinated Sergei Diaghilev, frightened Artur Rubinstein, and intimidated T.E. Lawrence. Léon Bax, Paul Poiret, Mariano Fortuny, and Erte dressed her. She dined with Picasso, hosted parties where Václav Nijinsky invited Isadora Duncan to dance, became the Italian futurist muse, and helped conjure up an elaborate marionette show with music by Maurice Ravel. Everywhere she went, she set trends, inspired genius, and astounded even the most jaded members of the aristocracy. Luisa Casati's egocentrism is both undeniable and linked inextricably to her historical significance. It was specifically the Marchesa's mania for continual transformation that propelled her quest for geniuses to document this lifelong process. Unlike the typical society patron, Casati was fearless in becoming an eager accomplice to the talent she supported. For them, she became a tangible and effective promotion of their radical artistic experiments. It seems a curious injustice, then, that one of the most portrayed women in history has been so little known. Even though numerous references to Casati appear in many art, history, and fashion books, no comprehensive full-length biography of her has been previously published. Such is history's fate for a life that can be too easily dismissed as idle, hedonistic, and thoroughly excessive. Our purpose in writing the biography is to accurately document for the first time both the life and legend of this singular woman. In presenting this, our hope is to ensure the Marchesa Casati's significant place in the artistic and cultural heritage of the 20th century and its continuation into this millennium. So we have a wide variety of topics to talk about because Casati's life touched so many areas of art, culture, history, more specifically, women's studies, fashion and art, and their transformative abilities. for both the viewer and, in the case of fashion, and the wearer. And we do have today, amongst our speakers, of course, all three of them have a tremendous and in-depth knowledge of costume, fashion, and how they play very important roles in the cultural landscape of the times in which we are talking, and beyond that. Casati lived a relatively long life, which spanned from the Belle Époque through to a good portion of the 20th century. And for someone to remain so remarkably vital and inspirational is quite rare. What I thought we might begin with as a point of departure, maybe we could return to Joan's comment about seeing that image of the Marchesa Casati mimicking, if you will, of some famous theatrical still photographs of Sarah Bernhardt as Empress Theodora. Why don't you speak for a moment, Joan, about that?
Yes, I was so surprised to see the picture of Sarah that Casati was clearly basing her costume for a ball in 1905. It was a costume ball in Rome, and she was dressed as Theodora, as played by Sarah Bernhardt. And I thought Bernhardt then was the most famous woman in the world, the most photographed, the most painted. If you saw the large exhibition at the Petit Palais recently, you saw that Sarah Bernhardt really was famous everywhere. Her most famous role was as Theodora, the Byzantine empress. So I found this picture in the book, and I noticed that it was the crown that Lalique had designed for Sarah, but it wasn't known if this crown had ever been made because there was no evidence for it in the many, many photographs of Sarah in the role of Theodora. She preferred a crown that was based on the mosaic at Ravenna. Looks more like a kokoshnik, and that crown still exists. It's in the Musée Galliera. But this one, there was only the little painting by Lalique that served as the cover of the program in 1902. So it was possible that this was actually the crown that Sarah didn't wear and was only in the painting, and the painting that clearly Casati was posing as.
Thank you. And what I want to take away from what you were saying, Joan, when you mentioned that at the time, Sarah Bernhardt was a world-renowned superstar. So when we see perhaps the Marchesa finding a kinship in her and really slavishly recreating that image, I think that may show in a way her at the start of her transformative process of perhaps looking outward and reaching out towards what was popular at that time and making it her own. But as she continued to go on and evolve, I think that she then gained a certain form of confidence and fearlessness that allowed her to not so much mimic others, but to express herself on the deepest level. And I'd like to use that as perhaps, Francesca, you have written so much about unconventional beauty, even bordering on the grotesque. And I don't want to jump too far ahead, but if we do go through the Marchesa's visual aesthetic over the course of years and decades, it does become that much more idiosyncratic, that much more strangely beautiful, and that much more uniquely her own. The Marchesa started out her life as a very awkward adolescent, not very confident about her own looks and her fitting into the conventions of the time. And that as she gained agency, that changed.
Yes, it's interesting. So she was born into an upper middle class Milanese family. And so the standards, not only of beauty, but of acceptable femininity for that demographics was quite restrictive. And she was not traditionally beautiful for the standards of the time. And I think she eventually, as you said, started to kind of cultivate her own persona, her own look. I mean, when I think of Casati in contemporary time, I almost think of her as like a club figure or somebody who is really just really performing the self in a very idiosyncratic, but also very creative way. I mean, she was her own work of art, as your book makes clear. As her work evolved and also participating in all these avant-garde spaces in Europe, I think she kind of became more and more daring in her looks, her makeup, her clothing. She went from working with couturier to going to costume design because the couturier's work was not fantasticals enough. And so, yes, I think she embraced almost this kind of ugly beauty that is questioning what is really beautiful, what was really beautiful in Europe at the time. I think it was probably also a reaction to the way she was perceived earlier on as not really fitting in.
Valerie, maybe this would be an opportunity for our listeners to try to put her shock value in the context historically of what was happening in fashion at that time.
Right. Well, as you look at her life, she goes through a wide variety of fantastic fashions. And as Francesca said, she starts out with couture, avant-garde couture, Fortuny, Poiret, and increasingly moves towards costume, whether the Erte costumes, Minaret, or boxed costumes, very much sort of ballet russe type costuming, all of which are pushing at the edge of the avant-garde. So it's a lot of fantasy imagery, Orientalist fantasies about women in the harem and bloodthirsty sultans, and the way she wrapped snakes around herself or walked with leopards, the stories that she would appear in St. Mark's Plaza dressed in a cape, leading a leopard on a leash, and under the cape would be naked. All of these are incredibly exhibitionistic and exaggerated versions of self-fashioning. Actually, my favorite thing, though, that I rediscovered rereading the book again last night was what you and Scott described as one of her more restrained fashion styles when she went out on the street one day wearing a black velvet V&A dress, a tiger skin top hat, and one black eye patch. And I just thought, oh my God, that's so fabulous. Galliano would have died for a look like that. That's so amazing. It's so perfect in terms of contemporary avant-garde theatrical fashion. And I think you can put her in that whole history from Poiret to Galliano and McQueen, a very theatrical fashion that teeters on the edge between couture and costume. We'll sometimes say as a criticism, oh, that's too costumey. But it's like Francesca saying, she's like a club kid. She's like somebody who's created these amazing look through costume, makeup, hair, all of which are exaggerated and fantastical, almost grotesque, teetering on the edge of decadence and grotesquerie.
Thank you. And Joan, how do you feel this would translate into more of a societal because of, the milieu in which she traveled, everyone from budding artists to political figures to nobility. Can you give us, Joan, just a sense of that type of shock and awe would be experienced by a French salon, let's say, or someone that came out of Proust's circle?
Well, she didn't have a conventional salon. There were so many society women, many people in Venice that she had a plot. So did the Curtis family at Palazzo Barbaro. Isabella Stewart Gardner was there. The Princesse de Polignac at the Palazzo Polignac, and so on. And these women, or Madame la Bonne Pluvinel at the Cardario, they had salons. They attracted writers, artists. There was conversation. she was so different. She had entertainments, but these parties were mostly a kind of setting for her own exhibition. Her costumes, her animals, the white peacocks. And as you said in the beginning, I think her great atu was that she didn't speak, that there was no message, that she remained an enigma, and still does. She seemed to put on these various masks and disguises, but what was behind the mask? It was a mystery. So she was very unlike the other social leaders, and we don't see her very often, or at least I didn't see evidence of her in other people's salons. You don't find her as a guest at someone's luncheon or dinner party. When you read people's diaries, they talk about her, but she's more a phenomenon. She was unique in that sense.
Absolutely. And, when Scott and I were writing the book, we wanted to present a portrait that showed, as much as we could, this extraordinary woman in all her shades and colors, light through dark. We really had to make a decision about not wanting to fall into pop psychologizing. I mean, one of the questions, of course, that a reader of the book would make why did she do what she did? What was her motivation? What did she think about? And there's very, very little that survives that gives anything more than a fairly superficial insight. We can make suppositions, we could make suggestions of what we thought, but we don't know definitively. As she, even during her younger years, but especially as she became older, part of her ensemble was a veil. And we tried to keep that as well with the book, to keep her as an enticement, as a mystery. But maybe from each of your perspectives, we could speak just a moment on what perhaps your own insights are on why Casati did what she did, or perhaps what was her motivation. And Francesca, with your work on unconventional beauty and the bizarre and the grotesque, and when you have focused on certain figures within and outside of the fashion world, have you found some kind of connectivity between some of those figures with the Marchesa? So, for example, if I'm recalling correctly, Erte once commented that the Marchesa was someone that he found extremely shy, which of course would seem at odds with egocentrism and exhibitionism. But then again, how did that such elaborateness perhaps function, psychologically speaking, for someone who was at core someone who's very private and shy? Have you seen that with other perpetrators of fashion crimes?
I'm not sure if I can make that connection at the top of my head. I think it's interesting how they use all these disguise for the self and masks, right? It reminds me of the carnival, and it's kind of makes sense that one of the form that she used to express herself was the masked ball. To me, there is this idea of wanting to not kind of have this fixed identity, but like continually transforming herself and seeking the edge of different identities. I think it's what's I found really interesting about the Marchesa Casati is that she foreshadowed a lot of play with gender that we have seen in the post-war years, much more coming to the fore, and definitely in the last 20, 30 years. And I keep returning to club culture and these figures like Lee Bowery, somebody that, like a Casati, makes this kind of confuses and questions the difference between reality and make-believe, right? Where is the reality of Casati when she's always in costume, she's always performing? So she's almost questioning the idea of an authentic self that exists from which everything else comes out of. So I think that's what's, to me, was very fascinating about the Marchesa Casati, and seemed really ahead of her time also in the way that she really lived her life between categories.
And Valerie, in the great gallery of significant fashion figures, the rule breakers, the iconoclasts, do you see an affinity between her and any of them in particular? And how might she differ from them? What were some of their similarities and what made her uniquely herself?
Well, what strikes me about her very powerfully is her exhibitionism. Thinking about it, it reminded me quite a bit of the Comtesse de Greffeux, Montesquieu's cousin, who also was someone who wanted to be sort of gazed at by a multitude of people and to sort of drink in their gaze. And that made her feel alive in a sense and energized through that vision of them looking at her. And it seems to me that with both of them, there was not the kind of idea of male exhibitionism, like look at my penis or look at my nakedness, but rather a more almost infantile, look at me, pay attention to me. So a demand so that she wouldn't disappear, that people would see her and she would feel reassured and happy by that gaze, as though the gaze kept her alive. Almost like Tinkerbell, in Peter Pan's like, believe in me and then you'll keep me alive. And so something very existential and desperate about that exhibitionism. But also, as Francesca said, the fact that look at me because I'm constantly changing. My look is constantly changing also implies a kind of deliberate artifice or a veil that she keeps. It's like you have to keep looking at me because I'm constantly changing and I'm always new and I'm always different. So you'll never stop being fascinated with me. So there's also a kind of strange artificial neophilia there, which is really interesting that she wants to be a kind of an artificial woman who's transformed all the time, that what's the descript a kind of a changeable, renewable second skin all the time.
And she belongs to a lineage, I think, that extends from Castiglione to Roberto Montesquieu to Casati. And it's interesting that she comes at the last of the line, but they're all fascinated by their own images, conspire to create images of themselves. Castiglione with Pearson, the photographer, over, I think, 4 decades, just documenting her own looks and curating her own photo shoots. And then Roberto Montesquieu doing the same thing. I was going to say before that there's an interesting photograph of him when he was only 19. He was asked to play the part of Zanetto in a play called Le Passant in a drawing room performance. And so that was Sarah Bernhardt's first big breakthrough role in, I think, 1864. So now, much later, he went to Sarah to have her coach him in the part. And in the photograph, he is sitting on some steps wearing the costume of Zanetto, supposed to be a Renaissance minstrel. And she's sitting next to him and she's wearing the costume. And they look like mirror images. And I think this fascination with your double, with the simulacra, with, of course, later the wax figures and so on. But, and Montesquieu kept all these photographs of himself from then on in albums that he called Ego Imago, image of myself. And then you think, am I the image? Perhaps that just means that I am an image or I am the appearance. And I think he then collected the photographs of Castiglione and as many relics of her as he could find and had a little chapel devoted to her. And after Casati bought his house after he died, she also had these same photographs. She too had a collection. She then had a ball in which she impersonated Castiglione. It's really a lineage. And these three personalities that were so similar in their self-adulation and their desire to be represented. Montesquieu also commissioned many portraits of himself. He was painted by Boldini, as she was. He was depicted by Trubetskoy, as she was. And then she moves into his house. their psychologies are interesting to consider together.
Yes, I think that that genealogy and that idea of the doubling that she identified with Castiglione and Montesquieu's doing some of the same things is so fascinating. And your reference to the wax figures, that she had the wax figure of herself dressed in the same clothes, it's really an amazing fascination, like an artificial double. Again, a kind of reassurance, I'm here. I'm here in spades. I'm here in duplicate.
And yet, there is an element of her work. I think it also relates to this idea of like being in a constant carnival, right? Where the rules and norms are lifted and when you're always in costume. But it also made her work ephemeral, right? And that's part of the reason, this ephemerality is part of the reason, I think, where she was not as remembered as she could have been until the biography and the subsequent also documentation of her work. I think it has to do with this ephemeral quality, not only of fashion, which was one of her means of expression, but also there was a real interest in things that were finite, right? She would put months and months into creating a masked ball, which in and of itself is an ephemeral kind of performative space that ends and is poorly documented.
Of course, that's true of fashion in general. So this love of self-fashioning is a kind of the constant repetition of ephemeral forms. I love too finding out that she commissioned a doll of herself from Lottie Pritzel, which is so amazing. That was a sort of a semi-nude, quasi-religious Baroque doll. That doll still exists?
We were in touch with a private collector who had many of them. And unfortunately, that person passed. And we were in touch with an author who was working on documenting Pritzel's life and had been behind an exhibition of on her, I believe, in Germany. I'm not sure the whereabouts of those items now. I mean, of Pritzel's collection and the majority of Casati. I mean, we have to remember that when the Marchesa's stars started misaligning during her latter years in Paris, which ended up in bankruptcy and in forced auction of her home, so much of her property was dispersed. So there really is not a tremendous that exists. I mean, it is a tragedy that we don't have a few costumes. I mean, there are little odds and ends here and there around the world, but there's very little that exists in that way. I think it might help to just take a moment for maybe each of us to comment of how the Marchesa transcended the time period. Some of these great art patrons, society figures are very much, more often than not, linked and bounded by the time period in which they lived. This is not true of the Marchesa. I will begin this by saying, well, it's a reflection of the nonstop activity and curiosity of her mind, in that she was not only reaching out to being represented by such, at the time, recognized geniuses in the art world or society painters such as Boldini, but she was also very much interested in seeking out new talent. So we have, the stories of her meeting with Man Ray, this American photographer relocated to Paris at the beginning of his career, who was very little known. The results of their photographic connection resulted in his getting many jobs with high-profile fashion magazines and helping to launch his career in a fuller way. So she was unhesitant to seek out the unconventional. She didn't want to rely just on what her peers might think was desirable. So Francesca, we know you have to end in a few moments. If you don't mind making a few final comments on what was uniquely, perhaps from your work, bizarrely wonderful and strangely beautiful in terms of her aesthetic and perspective and point of view that has allowed her to transcend her times. And here we are now, more than 100 years after her heyday, and we're here talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think A lot of it is that she was questioning traditional femininity, right? Traditional feminine roles of her time. I mean, she was certainly scandalous for a Milanese upper bourgeois society where she came from. And she was, I mean, it sounds like she was borderline scandalous for the avant-garde. So I think also a kind of threatening beauty, so to speak, that we have seen in contemporary fashion through McQueen, especially, is something that's remained relevant. So this going against a somewhat domesticated, or yes, more reassuring beauty, but also feminine roles, is what I think kept her interesting and kept her relevant into the 21st century.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your insights, Francesca. And Joan, you've written and spoken about some of the great feminine beauties and female icons of the Belle Époque, and even how there was a societal shift as the motion picture became popular, which was a massive industry in Italy. For which, of course, D'Annunzio, one of the Marchesa's most illustrious lovers and comrades, the great Italian poet, war hero, and society figure, worked for the silent film industry. In viewing these amazing women of that time period, who have not really, they're remarkable, but they haven't broken out of that time period. Do you have any thoughts on what allowed the Marchesa to do that, or what resulted in that? Was it that she was an outcast, or there was a time she no longer really cared about that?
Well, I feel that she was actually an anachronism. She seemed to belong to the world of late Romanticism, the world that Mario Prats describes in the Romantic Agony, or La carne, la morte e il diavolo. All these themes of the fatal woman, the Medusa, the macabre, the occult. She personified with her dark eyes, ringed with black coal. And she, I think, was then a model later for the silent film stars. I'm thinking of Musidora in Les Vampires by Feuillade. That was in, I think, about 1915, 1916. These vamps were now becoming sort of popular culture, whereas in the 1880s and 90s, that had been part of symbolism, that they'd been taken very seriously. These were Salome. I think of Oscar Wilde and the Beardsley image of Salome. She's a terrifying apparition. And I think Casati was also from very much in that category until the war. And then after the war, there was such a shift in culture, and she really became anachronistic. You don't see her as part of the jazz age. And, she left Venice in 1923. Cole Porter rented the Carasonico in 1925, brought his American black jazz band, had a floating nightclub on the canals. I mean, it was a totally different culture that she really was no longer in sync with. So I think she was the last gasp of Romanticism, and she was a beautiful late flower of that movement.
Thank you so much, John. That's extremely insightful, and that she was, as you mentioned, a throwback to an earlier ideal. And, I think what makes it even more fascinating now is that is absolutely valid. And then because of circumstances and what happened in her life as she lost her fortunes, and her desire to create and recreate herself was never diminished. So during her final decades in London, where she had to rely upon maybe picking around scraps of fabric and pinning things on herself, she was very Vivienne Westwood and very punk, and very inadvertently, as she's been called in the press in connection with our work, the grandmother of goth. So Valerie, I'd like to perhaps as we wrap up, for you to bring us up to date in how the Marchesa has been rediscovered by new generations, how she's become a figurehead in the goth community. And one of the most satisfying results of our work on the Marchesa is that a year does not go by when 18, 19, 20-year-old students, fashion students from around the world, are always reaching out to us, breathlessly proclaiming their discovery of the Marchesa and how she is their icon. That's remarkable.
Well, when I worked on my show, Gothic Dark Glamour, I had an endless stream of black-clad young people who were all so aware of the history of literature and art and film, and who really identified with all of these historical figures. It was really fascinating. I mean, you see how the history of the symbolist, idea of the femme fatale, or even going back further to the romantic imagery of, the Medusa, or, someone sitting there like a dangerous female. And this led up to be popularized with Theda Bara and vamps, and then vampires and the sexiness of vampires. It was strange because that show, which so appealed to young people, and especially, sort of English people and American young people. But I remember I had a group of Italian fashion executives that I was showing through Gothic, and they were sort of horrified, like, what is this, some kind of Halloween show? And then I said, but look, this is Galliano's, he's inspired by the Marchesa Casati. And they went, oh, La Decadenza. And finally they had something, that they could identify with. But in these ways, you see young people in the goth community looking back and pulling her out as an icon. I think that it's that kind of what Walter Benjamin talked about, the tiger's leap into the past, where if there's something that we desire now in fashion, we can find it in the past and bring it back to life. And so she continues to be an iconic figure, both for fashion designers and for young people, subcultural people.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I really feel that we've gained a few valuable insights with all of your amazing contributions to this. I want to thank each of you for your sharing your thoughts and ideas, which have all expanded the dark and amazing and beautiful universe of the Marchesa Casati. And I will just end with the little tagline that Scott and I devised 25 years ago with the very first publication of the first edition of the book, and the University of Minnesota Press, I might add, released a paperback version that was revised in 2004. And then more recently, they showed such support of the ongoing interest in infinite variety that they did something rather remarkable, which they re-released the book, which they had only up until that point printed in paperback, as a new hardcover. And they agreed to all of our revisions. So that 2017 University of Minnesota Press is the most up-to-date version of the book, with so many little treats and treasures in it in the English language. But I wanted to just end with the little tagline that we would share with anyone interested in the Marchesa, in reading any of the biographical works that we have done, and each of the participants' wonderful work, is prepare to be astonished.